They sent 3 rifles to silence a pregnant accountant they didn't plan for Simone Ferrari to be standing nearby. While everyone else dove for cover, the most dangerous man in the city sprinted straight into the kill zone and shielded her with his body. The next 24 hours didn't just save her life, they buried half the city's power structure. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. The first shot cracked through the parking structure at 2:14 inches the afternoon, and the world split into 2 kinds of people, those who ran away, and one man who didn't. Civilians scattered instantly. A woman dropped her groceries and sprinted for the stairwell. A man in a delivery uniform flattened himself behind a concrete pillar, hands over his head, eyes squeezed shut. 2 security guards near the entrance men paid specifically for moments like this, retreated behind their booth, and reached for radios instead of weapons. The gunfire didn't pause for any of them. 3 masked figures in tactical black moved through the structure's open mouth with the coordinated precision of men who had done this before. Balaclavas pulled tight, rifles raised. Muzzle flashes strobed orange against gray concrete walls as they advanced, the sound ricocheting off every surface until it felt like the shooting was coming from everywhere at once. On the ground near the center of the structure lay Victoria Hidalgo. She had fallen hard, one hand braced against the pavement, the other pressed flat against her stomach. Fingers splayed wide as if she could shield what was inside her through sheer will alone. Her dark hair fanned across the concrete. Her black top was pulled tight across 8 months of pregnancy, and her face, pale, sharp-featured, dark-eyed, was twisted not with panic but with something more terrifying than panic. Resolve. The resolve of a woman who understood exactly what was happening and why, and who was trying, despite everything, to stay conscious. Blood marked the ground beneath her left side. Not catastrophic, but real. The gunman closed the distance. No one moved toward her. And then from the far end of the structure, from the direction of the private access corridor where he had been heading for a discreet afternoon meeting that would now never happen, a figure broke into a run. He wasn't sprinting in desperation. He wasn't stumbling forward in shock. He moved with the long, ground-eating strides of a man whose body had been trained, long ago, to override the part of the brain that calculates survival odds. His charcoal suit jacket opened with the velocity of his movement. His white shirt opened 2 buttons at the collar. No tie caught the fluorescent light of the structure as he crossed open ground. His hands were tattooed from knuckle to wrist, dark ink crawling up both forearms and climbing the thick column of his neck. His hair dark blonde, cut tight on the sides, swept back from a hard-boned face, didn't move. His jaw was set. His dark eyes were fixed on Victoria and nothing else. Simone Ferrari did not reach for a weapon. He did not shout orders to anyone. He simply ran. A burst of gunfire tracked toward him. Sparks exploded from the concrete a foot to his left, then half a foot, then inches, a shooter correcting his aim in real time. Simone dropped his shoulder and changed angle without breaking stride, the way a man moves when evasion is muscle memory rather than thought. He hit the ground in a controlled drop as he reached her, one knee absorbing the impact, his body rotating instantly to place himself between Victoria and the 3 advancing rifles. "Stay with me," he said. His voice was quiet, completely level. She looked up at him. For 1 second, her expression said everything: the confusion of being shielded by a man she recognized and feared, the desperate gratitude of someone who had accepted she was about to die and was now being offered an alternative. He got an arm beneath her. He was built for this, broad through the shoulders, powerful through the chest, the kind of physical presence that made the task of lifting a woman 8 months pregnant look, if not easy, then entirely within the realm of what his body could absorb. He pulled her upright against him, kept his back to the gunman, and moved toward the nearest concrete pillar in a low, controlled crouch. Bullets sparked the ground behind them. He didn't flinch. He pressed her against the pillar's far side, positioned his body at the exposed angle, and finally turned his head to look at the 3 shooters now repositioning, recalculating, suddenly less certain now that their target was shielded by a variable they had not planned for. Simone Ferrari stared at them with an expression that was not fury, not fear, not bravado. It was recognition. He knew what kind of men these were. He had employed men like these. He had sent men like these on assignments he did not allow himself to think about afterward. And in the cold, practiced steadiness of their movements, he could read something that most people in the structure could not. This ambush was not random. Sirens rose in the distance, faint, then swelling. The 3 gunmen exchanged a look behind their balaclavas. The calculation shifted. One held position for a breath too long. Then all 3 turned and moved back toward the structure's exit in the same coordinated way they had entered. They didn't run. They withdrew. The structure fell into an echoing, disoriented silence, broken only by Victoria's unsteady breathing against Simon's shoulder and the distant wail of approaching emergency vehicles. He looked down at her. Her hand was still pressed to her stomach. Her eyes were open and tracking alert, despite everything. "The baby," she said. "Ambulance is coming." He said it the way he said most things, as a statement of fact rather than a reassurance. But he didn't move away from her. He kept his body between her and the open space until the first responders appeared at the structure's entrance 2 minutes later. Security cameras recorded all of it. Every frame, every stride, every second of a feared man placing himself between a pregnant woman and 3 rifles without hesitation, without calculation, without asking a single question about who she was or what she was worth to anyone. The footage reached local news within the hour. By evening, it had traveled further than that. And somewhere across the city, in the offices and back rooms of people who had believed Simone Ferrari entirely predictable, entirely controllable, entirely theirs to manage the footage played on a screen, and the air in the room changed. Because the man they had built their plans around had just done something none of their plans had accounted for. He had chosen someone else over himself, and that changed everything. The footage played on a loop across every screen in the city. But in a private office on the 14th floor of a building that appeared, on every public record, to belong to a legitimate import consulting firm, the screen had been dark for an hour. Simone Ferrari didn't need to watch the footage again. He had lived it. What he needed, sitting alone in a chair that cost more than most people's monthly rent, was to understand why watching it back made something move inside his chest that he had spent years making sure stayed still. He poured 2 fingers of scotch and didn't drink it. Outside, the city moved the way it always moved, indifferent, continuous, unaware of the architecture beneath its surface, the docks, the clubs, the financial channels that existed in the negative space between legal transactions, invisible to anyone who didn't know precisely where to look. Simone had built that architecture with the same cold patience he applied to everything. Not through violence alone, though violence had been present, early, when it needed to be. Through precision, through the disciplined understanding that power maintained quietly is power that lasts. He had been 26 when he inherited what remained of his father's network, a fractured, bleeding thing that rivals were already circling. He had been 30 when those same rivals stopped circling. Not because he had destroyed them, because he had made himself more useful to them than conflict would have been. That was the thing most people misunderstood about Simone Ferrari. He was not a man who ruled through fear alone. Fear was a blunt instrument. It required constant maintenance, constant escalation. Simone ruled through architecture, through making himself the indispensable center of arrangements that benefited enough powerful people that dismantling him meant dismantling themselves. Shipping manifests that moved through the southern docks bore his signature in the form of a silence, an absence of inspection, of delay, of questions. 3 private clubs in the city's financial district operated under licenses tied to holding companies that traced back, through 4 layers of corporate paperwork, to accounts he controlled. A network of offshore channels moved money for men whose public faces appeared on charitable foundation boards and city council agendas. His consigliere, Rafael Duarte, 10 years his senior, silver-haired, precise, managed the human element, the relationships, the diplomacy, the careful stroking of egos that Simone had no patience for. Between them, they had constructed something that functioned less like a criminal empire and more like a parallel government, operating in the spaces the legitimate one left unattended. Simone set the glass down without drinking. He thought about the woman on the concrete, her hand on her stomach, the particular quality of her stillness, not the stillness of someone who had given up, but of someone conserving what little they had left for what came next. He had seen that quality of stillness once before. The memory arrived the way it always did, not announced, not gradual, but sudden and total. The way a door opening onto a cold room changes the temperature of the space you're standing in. Her name had been Isabella. She had been the only person in Simone's adult life who had looked at him, at all of him. The suits and the silence and the weight that lived behind his eyes, and had not looked away. She hadn't romanticized what he was. She hadn't pretended the danger wasn't real. She had simply decided, with the same quiet stubbornness she applied to everything, that she loved him anyway, that the man she saw beneath the architecture was worth staying for. They had been married 4 years when she became pregnant. The pregnancy had been without complication until the final weeks, when it wasn't. Simon had been in a meeting he couldn't leave, or had told himself he couldn't leave, which amounted to the same thing when the call came. By the time he reached the hospital, the decisions had already been made without him. Isabella hadn't survived. The baby hadn't survived. Simon had stood in a hospital corridor in his tailored suit, surrounded by people who feared him, and felt the precise moment that something fundamental inside him calcified, sealed over, became something harder and colder than it had been before, and he had decided not consciously, not in words, but in the way a man's body makes decisions that his mind ratifies later, that he would never again allow anything to matter that much. He had not spoken of it since. Not to Raphael. Not to anyone. He had returned to his empire the following week, and run it with a focus and efficiency that those around him interpreted as strength. They were not wrong, exactly, but strength and absence are not always distinguishable from the outside. 12 years had passed. And then this afternoon, in a parking structure 3 blocks from the financial district, he had seen a woman in black fall to the ground with her hand pressed to her stomach, and 12 years of calcified silence had simply cracked open, the way stone cracks in cold weather, suddenly and without warning. He hadn't thought about Isabella in that moment. He hadn't thought about anything. He had just run. Now, sitting in the chair that cost more than most people's rent, Simon Ferrari allowed himself to do something he rarely permitted. He sat with what he had done and did not immediately convert it into strategy. He did not ask what it meant for his position. He did not calculate the exposure, the liability, the perception shift among rivals and allies alike. He just sat with it. The footage would complicate things. He understood that already. Men who had arrangements with him would be unsettled by the unpredictability of what he'd done. Men who wanted him gone would be looking for the angle. The shooting itself, 3 professional gunmen, coordinated, targeting a pregnant woman near a parking structure he'd had no public reason to be near, was a message he hadn't yet fully decoded. But there was something else, something he had not yet let himself examine directly, the way you avoid looking straight at something bright until your eyes adjust. He had not felt afraid in that parking structure. He had not felt the cold calculation that governed every other decision he made. He had felt for the first time in 12 years like himself. Not the architecture, not the empire, the man who had once believed that protecting something mattered more than controlling it. He looked at the untouched scotch. He thought about Victoria Hidalgo in a hospital bed across the city, her hand still curved over her stomach. He thought about what she had said before the ambulance doors closed. They knew I was going to testify. He picked up his phone. There were things, he was beginning to understand, that could not be managed from a distance any longer. Victoria Hidalgo had always been precise. It was the quality that had made her exceptional at her work. The ability to sit with columns of numbers for hours without losing the thread, to follow a financial trail through layers of misdirection the way other people followed a conversation, intuitively, without effort. Her colleagues at Restrepo Construction had called her meticulous. Her supervisor had called her invaluable. The partners had smiled at her across conference tables and signed her performance reviews with generous bonuses, and had never, not once, imagined she would look too closely at the wrong set of accounts. That had been their first mistake. She lay in the hospital bed now, her hands folded over her stomach. The habit had become unconscious over 8 months. This constant checking, this wordless reassurance offered downward, and stared at the ceiling, while a detective she didn't fully trust asked questions she had already answered twice. The baby moved. A slow, rolling shift. She exhaled. Still here. Both of them. Miss Hidalgo. The detective, mid-40s, patient in the way that felt practiced, rather than genuine, leaned forward slightly. Can you walk me through the timeline once more? When did you first notice the irregularities? Victoria turned her head and looked at him with the dark, level gaze that had, on more than one occasion, made auditors considerably senior to her look away first. I've already given you the timeline, she said, twice. Humor me. She looked back at the ceiling. It had begun 7 months ago, when she was barely showing and still naive enough to believe that what she'd found was a clerical error. A construction project in the Southern District, legitimate contracts, legitimate permits, legitimate everything on the surface, with a payment structure that didn't make sense. Subcontractors being paid through holding companies she couldn't trace to any registered entity. invoices for materials that didn't correspond to any purchase orders she could locate, money moving in and then out through channels that existed, as far as she could determine, purely to move money. She had flagged it internally, the way the compliance handbook said to. Nothing happened. She had flagged it a second time, in writing, to the senior partner whose name appeared on the relevant project file. He had smiled at her across a conference table and told her she was likely looking at a legacy accounting structure from a previous acquisition and not to worry herself about it. She had gone home that evening and sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours. Then she had picked up her phone and called the Financial Crimes Division. That had been 5 months ago. The investigation that followed was sealed, her identity protected, her cooperation confidential, her testimony scheduled for 3 weeks from now before a federal grand jury that was, she had been told, building a case that extended considerably beyond Restrepo construction. She had told no one. Not her sister. Not the colleague she sometimes had lunch with. Not the man who was supposedly the baby's father, though that particular absence had resolved itself before she'd ever made the call he had left, before she started showing. And she had decided, with the same quiet finality she applied to decisions she'd already made, that she would not spend energy on regret. She had been careful, she had been precise, and someone had still found out. "The accounts," she said to the ceiling, answering the detective's question because answering it was what she could control right now. "I found the first irregularity in March. Payment routed through a shell company registered in a jurisdiction that doesn't require beneficial ownership disclosure. The amounts were structured to stay below reporting thresholds individually. Collectively, across 18 months of transactions, they represented approximately $4 million moving through the project's books without a traceable origin." The detective was writing. "That was the first layer," Victoria continued. "The second layer took me 3 weeks to map. The shell company receiving payments from Restrepo had a corresponding account that made distributions to 4 separate entities. One of those entities shared a registered agent with a company that held a lease on a building I recognized. A building on the docks." She paused. The detective looked up. "A building I recognized," she repeated, "because I had processed a separate lease payment for it 18 months earlier, from a different client file entirely. A client with no apparent connection to Restrepo or the Southern District project." "What was the client's name?" Victoria looked at him directly now. "It's in the materials I gave your financial crimes colleagues 5 months ago," she said, "along with the names of the city officials whose signatures appeared on permits linked to 3 of the 4 entities, along with the name of the law enforcement officer whose spouse is listed as a director of one of the shell companies." She let that sit for a moment. "I was thorough." The detective's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind it. "Good," Victoria thought. "Be uncomfortable. Someone in your building is in those files." She looked back at the ceiling. What she hadn't told the detective, what she hadn't told anyone, because she was still processing what it meant, was what she had recognized the moment Simone Ferrari reached her on the parking structure concrete. She knew his name. Everyone in the city knew his name, the way they knew the names of weather systems as a force you tracked and planned around, rather than something you engaged with directly. But she knew more than his name. Buried in the transaction records she had spent 5 months mapping, in the network of shell companies and holding structures and silent financial arrangements, one name appeared at a remove of 3 corporate layers from a cluster of the most significant transactions. Ferrari-adjacent entities. That was how she had labeled them in her own notes. She had not yet determined whether his involvement was central or incidental, whether he was an architect of the laundering network, or simply a man whose infrastructure had been borrowed without his full knowledge by people with their own agenda. And then he had sprinted across open concrete to shield her from the men those same people had sent to silence her. She pressed her hands more firmly against her stomach. The baby moved again, stronger this time, an elbow or a knee tracing a slow arc against her palm, and Victoria felt the particular rush of fierce, uncomplicated love that had become, over 8 months, the only thing she was entirely certain of. "They knew I was going to testify," she said quietly, more to herself than the detective. "Miss Hidalgo, which means someone told them." She turned her head. Her dark eyes were steady and entirely without fear. The way eyes look when fear has already been processed and set aside in favor of something more useful. "Someone with access to a sealed federal investigation told them where I would be and when." The detective said nothing. Outside the hospital window, the city continued its indifferent movement. And in the sealed financial records, Victoria had spent 5 months assembling records that were, right now, sitting in a federal evidence vault, the full shape of what had tried to kill her this afternoon, was waiting, patient and precise, to be seen. Simone Ferrari did not sleep. He sat at the long table in the private room above the club on Meridian Street, a room that existed on no floor plan, accessed through a corridor behind the wine storage that his architect had been generously compensated to forget. And he worked through the night, the way he had always worked through problems that mattered, methodically, without emotion, one thread at a time. By 3 a.m, 4 burner phones sat disassembled on the table. A laptop running through an encrypted server displayed transaction logs, internal communication threads, and a map of his organization's current operational structure. 2 tumblers of scotch sat untouched at his elbow. A single lamp threw a pool of amber light across the documents spread before him, and outside the city breathed its nighttime breath, slow and unaware. He had started with the most basic question. How had 3 professional gunmen known that Victoria Hidalgo would be at that parking structure, at that specific time, on that specific afternoon? The answer required working backward. Victoria's movements would have been known to the federal investigation handling her testimony. That circle was small and theoretically sealed. Beyond that, her daily patterns, workplace, routes, appointments, would have been known to a much smaller circle. People close to her, people watching her, or people watching him, because Simone had not been there by accident either. His meeting that afternoon, the discreet arrangement in the private access corridor of the parking structure, had been scheduled 4 days earlier through Rafael Duarte, a routine coordination meeting with a financial intermediary who managed one of the offshore distribution channels. The kind of meeting that appeared on no calendar, was communicated through no traceable message, and was known to exactly 3 people: Simone, the intermediary, Rafael. He pulled up the internal communications thread from the past 2 weeks and read it the way he read everything. Not for what was there, but for what wasn't. The intermediary had confirmed the meeting location. Rafael had relayed the confirmation. Standard, clean, unremarkable. Except, Simone leaned forward. The confirmation from the intermediary had come through at 11 a.m, 4 days prior. Rafael had relayed it to Simone at 2 p.m. of the same day. A 3-hour gap that had never registered as significant because 3-hour gaps in communication were normal, were human, were the texture of ordinary days. But Simone pulled the intermediary's original message timestamp again and read it carefully. The message had been sent from a device registered to a server location in the financial district. He cross-referenced that server location against his own records, the meticulous, obsessive records he kept of every digital footprint connected to his operations, because information was the only currency that never depreciated. The server location had one other appearance in his records, a communication thread from 8 months ago, a thread he had filed and not returned to because at the time it had seemed like a low-level operational detail, an internal query about routing adjustments on the southern dock shipments, a query that had originated from the same server location and had been responded to by Rafael Duarte. Simone sat back. He did not move for a long time. He was not a man who reached conclusions emotionally. He had seen, over the years, what happened to men who confused suspicion with proof, the cascade of wrong decisions that followed, the collateral destruction, the enemies manufactured from allies through nothing more than paranoia. He had disciplined himself against it the way you discipline yourself against any dangerous reflex. But this was not suspicion. This was a thread, pulled carefully from the fabric of 10 years of trust, unraveling into a shape he recognized. Rafael Duarte had been with him since the beginning, had managed the human architecture of the empire with a precision and loyalty that Simone had never had reason to question, had sat across from him at this same table through negotiations that had reshaped the city's underworld, through crises that had demanded absolute trust between them, through the silent period after Isabella, when Simone had barely spoken, and Rafael had simply continued working as though normalcy were a thing he could hold in place through sheer professionalism. 10 years, and somewhere in those 10 years, something had shifted. Simone forced himself to continue pulling the thread rather than stopping where it hurt. He cross-referenced the server location against financial records. The offshore distribution channel that the intermediary managed, the one the Meridian Street meeting had been about, showed routing adjustments over the past 18 months that he had approved without granular review, because Rafael had presented them as administrative optimizations, and Simone had trusted the assessment. He reviewed them granularly now. An hour later, He had identified approximately $6 million that had moved through his network's channels in ways that didn't serve his network's interests. Money that had passed through his infrastructure like water through a pipe, using his organization's architecture, his organization's protection, his organization's silence, and had deposited itself in structures he did not control and had not authorized. Someone had been using him, not fighting him, not rivaling him, using him, his empire, as a vehicle, his reputation as a shield, his infrastructure as a laundry. And the attack on Victoria Hidalgo, the sealed federal witness whose testimony would expose financial trails, suddenly made a different kind of sense. It wasn't just about silencing her, it was about triggering a response from him. If Victoria died in that parking structure, the investigation would intensify. Fingers would point toward the criminal figure who had been present at the scene. The financial trails in her evidence files, trails that ran through Ferrari-adjacent entities, would be interpreted not as evidence of a man being used without his knowledge, but as evidence of a man eliminating a witness. The plan had been elegant and entirely ruthless. Kill Victoria. Frame Simon. Ignite a conflict between his fractured allies and the rival factions now emboldened by his apparent exposure. Remove him in the chaos either through law enforcement or through the violence that would follow. And Rafael Duarte, silver-haired and precise and trusted absolutely, would step into whatever remained. Simon closed the laptop. He sat in the amber light for a long time and allowed himself briefly, privately, in a room that existed on no floor plan, to feel the specific quality of pain that comes not from an enemy's action, but from a betrayal so close, it rewrites memory. Every conversation, every shared silence, every year of a partnership he had believed was real. Then he set it aside, not because it didn't matter, because what he did next mattered more. He picked up the one phone that was still assembled, a number known to no one in his organization, and held it in his tattooed hand for a moment. The city had spent 12 years fearing Simon Ferrari. It was about to be surprised by him. He began to dial. He wore the same suit. That detail would matter to people later, the journalists who picked it apart, the commentators who debated its significance, the ordinary citizens who watched the footage on their phones and couldn't stop talking about it. The same charcoal suit he had worn in the parking structure. The same white shirt, open 2 buttons at the collar. The same polished black shoes that had carried him across, sparking concrete toward 3 rifles without hesitation. He had not changed. Whether that was deliberate or simply the result of a man who had spent the night working through betrayal and arrived at dawn with no patience left for performance, no one who watched the footage could say for certain, but it registered. It stayed with people. The idea that he had moved from that parking structure, through a sleepless night of reckoning, and arrived at the front steps of the central precinct without pausing to reconstruct himself into something more presentable. He arrived at 7:43 inches the morning. The press was not there yet. That would come later, when someone inside the building made a call they shouldn't have, and the vans arrived, and the cameras assembled, and the footage began its journey across every platform and screen in the city. But in the moment Simon Ferrari pushed through the precinct's front door, both hands visible, nothing in them, moving with the same unhurried deliberateness that characterized everything he did. The lobby held only a desk officer, 2 detectives arriving for the morning shift, and a custody sergeant who looked up from his coffee and did not immediately process what he was seeing. Simon stopped at the front desk. "I need to speak with federal coordination," he said. "Not local, federal." The desk officer stared at him. "My name is Simon Ferrari." He said it the way he said everything, quietly, without emphasis, as a statement of fact, rather than an announcement. "I believe you know who I am." The lobby went very still. They put him in an interview room on the 3rd floor. Not a holding cell, not yet, because the duty supervisor who made that call was experienced enough to understand that the legal architecture around what was happening needed to be constructed carefully and quickly, and that a misstep now could compromise everything that followed. Simon sat in the chair with his forearms on the table, hands folded, and waited with the patience of a man who had conducted 1,000 negotiations in rooms designed to make him feel at a disadvantage. The federal coordinator arrived 40 minutes later. A woman mid-50s, compact, with the particular quality of stillness that Simon recognized as belonging to people who had spent long careers in rooms exactly like this one. She sat across from him without preamble and placed a recording device on the table between them. "Mr. Ferrari." "I have conditions," he said. "I'm sure you do." "One condition," he corrected. "Federal protection for Victoria Hidalgo. Immediate." Not a patrol outside her hospital room. Actual protection, relocation, identity security, witness protocol, for her and her child. The coordinator looked at him for a moment. That's your opening position. That's my only position. Everything else is negotiable. That isn't. Another moment passed. What are you offering in exchange? Simon reached into his interior jacket pocket and placed 3 encrypted drives on the table. Then a folded document, handwritten, dense with names and figures and dates. Then a 4th drive, smaller than the others, which he set apart from the group. 18 months of internal financial communications, he said, indicating the first 3 drives. Transaction records across 6 offshore channels. The routing structures used to move approximately $40 million through infrastructure associated with my organization infrastructure. I did not authorize for that purpose. He touched the folded document. Names, dates, corresponding positions within city government and law enforcement. He looked at the coordinator steadily. The 4th drive contains communications between a serving deputy commissioner and representatives of 2 rival syndicate factions, including communications that reference the planning of yesterday's attack. The coordinator did not reach for the drives. Not yet. She was too experienced for that. You understand, she said carefully, that the material on these drives, if authentic, implicates your own organization. Yes, and implicates you, by association, in financial crimes that carry... Yes. He didn't need the sentence finished. I'm aware of what I'm sitting in. I'm not here because I believe I walk away clean. I'm here because the alternative is allowing the people who tried to use my name to bury a pregnant woman to continue operating while I retaliate through channels that will cost more lives and resolve nothing. The coordinator was quiet for a moment. Outside the interview room, through the narrow reinforced window in the door, Simone could see movement building in the corridor, more people arriving, phones being consulted, the particular energy of an institution recalibrating in real time. There's one more thing, he said. He unfolded a 2nd document and placed it on the table beside the drives. Rafael Duarte, my consigliere. His voice remained level. He'll attempt to move within the next 48 hours when he realizes I've come in. There's a private airfield outside the city. Coordinates are on that document where he has an arrangement for emergency departure. He'll go there. A pause. Don't let him leave. The coordinator looked at the document. Then at Simone. You're giving up your own man. Simone held her gaze. He gave me up first. The press arrived at 9:15. By then, the footage from a lobby security camera, someone's call, someone's phone, someone's moment of poor judgment or deliberate agenda, had already reached 3 local outlets simultaneously. By 9:30, it was national. By 10 o'clock, the image was fixed in the city's collective consciousness with the permanence of things that cannot be unseen. Simon Ferrari, in his charcoal suit, hands visible and empty, walking through the front door of the central precinct. The feared kingpin. Voluntary, unhurried, carrying evidence that would dismantle the empire he had built with 12 years of cold precision. The city divided instantly, the way cities divide when something ruptures the familiar narrative. Half saw strategy, a cornered man controlling the terms of his own capture. Half saw something they couldn't quite name, something that sat uncomfortably close to conscience. In a hospital room across the city, Victoria Hidalgo watched the footage on a small mounted screen and pressed her hands flat against her stomach and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, quietly, to no one in particular, "He actually did it." The baby moved beneath her hands. Outside her room, 2 federal agents had already taken position in the corridor. The raids began at dawn on the 3rd day. Not the tentative, procedural kind, the kind that announced themselves with paperwork and courtesy calls to legal teams, and the careful choreography of institutions that feared being wrong more than they feared being slow. These were federal. Coordinated across 11 locations simultaneously. Timed to a precision that reflected weeks of preparation, suddenly unleashed by 48 hours of the most significant intelligence transfer the city's financial crimes division had received in a decade. Simon's encrypted drives had not merely opened doors, they had removed walls. The first location was a luxury residential tower in the financial district's northern edge, the kind of building where the concierge knew every resident by name, and the security desk required biometric confirmation for visitor access. At 5:47 inches the morning, that security desk was bypassed by federal warrant, and 12 agents moved through the lobby with the quiet efficiency of people who had rehearsed this specific sequence enough times That urgency no longer required noise. The penthouse on the 31st floor belonged, on paper, to a property holding company registered in a jurisdiction that asked few questions. In practice, it was where Deputy Commissioner Harold Price kept the life that ran parallel to his decorated public career: the encrypted communications equipment, the secondary financial records, the carefully maintained distance between who he was at a podium and who he was in private arrangements with men whose names appeared in federal indictments. Price was still asleep when they came through the door. He was led out in handcuffs at 6:15, past the concierge who had greeted him by name every morning for 4 years, into a gray dawn that held no courtesy and no choreography. The image reached the press by 7. The second location was Simon's own shipping operation on the southern docks. He had expected this. Had, in fact, included the operational details in the documentation he surrendered: the manifest irregularities, the inspection arrangements, the names of port officials whose cooperation had been purchased over years with the kind of patience that doesn't appear on any financial record. He had handed them the architecture and told them where every load-bearing wall was. Watching it come down, from a federal holding facility across the city where he remained in a custody arrangement that was neither comfortable nor punitive but simply procedural, Simon felt something he did not immediately have a word for. Not regret, not satisfaction. Relief, perhaps. The specific, exhausting relief of a man who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has finally set it down, regardless of what that means for what comes next. The third location was an airport, the private airfield 20 minutes outside the city's limits, where a small charter operation ran legitimate flights as cover for the occasional arrangement that required neither manifest nor customs declaration. The coordinates Simon had provided were precise, because Simon's information was always precise. Rafael Duarte arrived at the airfield at 6:52 inches the morning. He was dressed for travel: a gray overcoat, a carry-on case that federal analysts would later determine contained 3 passports issued under different names, approximately $80,000 in mixed currency, and a secondary encrypted device that took the digital forensics team 11 hours to crack. He walked toward the charter terminal with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed his arrangements were still intact. They were not. 4 federal vehicles were already positioned across the access road when Raphael's car turned through the airfield gate. He stopped, sat for a moment in the stillness of a man whose calculations have just returned an outcome he did not anticipate. Then he stepped out of the car with his hands raised slowly, precisely, with the particular dignity of someone who understands that the performance of composure is the last form of control available to him. He was in custody by 7/8. He did not speak during the arrest, did not ask questions, did not, as far as the arresting agents observed, display anything resembling surprise. What he displayed, in the brief moment before he was placed in the vehicle, was something one of the agents described later in a debrief as recognition. The expression of a man who had known, on some level, that this particular morning was always going to come and had simply been running the clock until it did. By midday, the cascade had reached the levels Simon's documentation had promised, and the federal task force had believed but not entirely anticipated. 2 city council members were contacted for voluntary interviews and arrived with lawyers. A senior figure in the Financial Crimes Division itself, a name that appeared 3 layers deep in the transaction records, connected to a shell entity through his brother-in-law's business registration, was placed on administrative suspension, pending investigation. 3 private banks received simultaneous account freeze orders that locked approximately $60 million across instruments connected to the network. The empire didn't fall dramatically. It collapsed the way financial structures always collapse, not in a single moment of visible destruction, but in the cascading failure of interdependencies, each one pulling the next. The whole architecture coming apart in sequence, because the architecture had been built on the assumption that its center would hold. The center had surrendered itself. Across the city, in offices and corridors, and the private rooms of people who had believed themselves insulated by enough layers of separation and enough years of careful arrangement, phones were silenced, meetings were canceled, and the particular quality of fear spread that belongs to people who have built comfortable lives on foundations they always knew were wrong. In the hospital, Victoria Hidalgo watched the news coverage with the sound turned low. She watched Price's image, the deputy commissioner in his decorated uniform, now in handcuffs on the steps of his building, and felt not triumph but something quieter and more complicated. The satisfaction of a person whose account of events has been violently confirmed, mixed with the exhaustion of having paid too high a price for the confirmation. Her baby shifted inside her. 3 weeks early, the doctors had said, was a real possibility given the trauma of the attack. They were monitoring. They were cautious. They used words like stable and reassuring, and she appreciated the words without fully believing them. She picked up her phone. There was one call she needed to make, not to her lawyer, not to the federal coordinator, not to her sister who had arrived from out of town the previous evening and was currently sleeping in the visitor chair in the corner. She needed to speak to the man in federal custody who had handed over an empire to keep her alive. She wasn't sure what she would say, but she knew, with the same precision that had made her exceptional at mapping financial trails through layers of misdirection, that the conversation needed to happen. Some debts couldn't be carried indefinitely. Some things needed to be said directly, face to face, by people who had survived something together and owed each other at least the honesty of acknowledging it. She began to dial. The courtroom was full in the way that rooms are full when history is being made, and everyone present understands it. Every seat in the public gallery occupied. Journalists in the designated press section with their notebooks open, and their expressions carefully neutral, the practiced blankness of people trained to observe without visibly reacting, though several had already failed at this when the morning's first witness had taken the stand. Legal teams arranged on both sides of the aisle with the particular controlled energy of people who had prepared extensively and were now discovering that preparation only takes you so far when the testimony begins to move the room. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the expression of someone who had presided over enough proceedings to be unsurprisable, had called for order twice before 10 o'clock, not because the gallery was disruptive, because the silence itself had a quality that needed managing. The held-breath silence of a room waiting for something it has been promised will be significant and is beginning to believe the promise. Victoria Hidalgo had taken the stand at 9:15. She had dressed carefully. Not to perform, Victoria had no patience for performance, but because she understood that what she wore would be read, whether she intended it or not, and she preferred to control the reading. Dark trousers. A structured jacket in deep navy. Her dark hair pulled back from her face with the clean severity of someone who wanted nothing between her expression and the room. She was 37 weeks now. The pregnancy was visible and undeniable, and she had declined, when her lawyer suggested it, any accommodation that would allow her to testify remotely or from a seated position behind a screen. She sat in the witness box upright and looked at the room without apology. The prosecutor led her through the financial evidence first, the transaction records, the shell company structures, the mapping she had spent 5 months assembling in the evenings after work, with her laptop open on the kitchen table and her tea going cold beside her. She answered each question with the precision that had made her exceptional at her work, walking the room through layers of financial architecture that most people in the gallery could not fully follow, but could feel the weight of the accumulated density of evidence that spoke to years of coordinated deception. Then the prosecutor brought her to the parking structure. "Miss Hidalgo," he said, his voice modulating into something slightly quieter. "Can you describe for the court what you experienced on the afternoon of the incident?" Victoria looked at her hands for a moment, then back at the room. "I had parked on the second level," she said. "I was returning to my car after an appointment with my obstetrician." A brief pause. "I heard the first shot before I understood what it was. By the time I understood, I had already fallen. Can you describe the circumstances of your fall?" "The shock of the first shot, I stepped back, lost my footing. The ground was faster than I expected." She said it plainly, without dramatization, which made it more affecting than dramatization would have. "I couldn't get up. The baby's weight had shifted my center of gravity, and my left side had hit the concrete, and I couldn't get the leverage. The room was absolutely still. And then?" the prosecutor prompted gently. Victoria's expression changed, something moving through it that she allowed to show, briefly, before the composure returned. "And then he was there," she said. She described it the way she described everything, precisely, sequentially, without embellishment. The sound of his footsteps on concrete approaching rather than retreating, the shadow of him falling across her before she saw his face, his body positioning itself between her and the direction of the gunfire, the specific quality of his voice when he spoke to her. He said, "Stay with me," she told the court. That was all, 2 words, and then he lifted me. She looked at the room steadily. "I want to be clear about something," she said, without waiting for the next question. "I recognized him. I knew who he was. And in that moment, knowing who he was made what he was doing more significant, not less, because a man with his resources, His instincts, his entire history of self-preservation, that man running toward Gunfire, made no rational sense. She paused, which meant it wasn't rational. It was something else. The prosecutor let the silence hold. Then he said quietly, "Thank you, Miss Hidalgo." Simon took the stand at 11. He moved through the courtroom with the same unhurried deliberateness that had characterized every public appearance since the morning of his surrender, the charcoal suit replaced today by something equally precise, equally dark, a man who understood that presentation was a form of language and had chosen to speak clearly. His tattooed hands rested on the railing of the witness box. His dark eyes moved across the room once, taking inventory, then settled on the prosecutor with the focused stillness of someone prepared to be fully present for what came next. The prosecutor walked him through the financial testimony efficiently, Simon's account of how his infrastructure had been used without his authorization, the timeline of his realization, the decision to surrender rather than retaliate. Simon answered in the same quiet, factual register he used for everything, and the room leaned forward slightly, with each answer in the involuntary way of people hearing something they hadn't expected to believe and finding, despite themselves, that they did. Then the prosecutor paused, looked at his notes, looked back at Simon. "Mr. Ferrari," he said, "I have one final question." Simon waited. "On the afternoon of the incident in the parking structure, when you saw Miss Hidalgo on the ground, why did you run toward the gunfire?" The courtroom held its breath. Simon was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man constructing an answer. The silence of a man deciding how much of the true answer to speak aloud in a room full of people who would record and interpret and carry it back out into the world. Then he said, "She was carrying a future." His voice was low and entirely steady. "I've taken enough from this city. I wasn't going to let it take that." No one moved. Not the journalists. Not the legal teams. Not the gallery. Even the judge, who had spent decades cultivating unsurprisability, was still. Simon looked at his hands on the railing, the tattooed knuckles, the ink that climbed toward his collar, the permanent record written on his skin of a life built on control and distance, and the disciplined avoidance of exactly the kind of moment that had occurred in that parking structure. Across the courtroom, he did not look at Victoria, but she looked at him. And in the expression on her face, precise, guarded, and entirely honest, was something that the room couldn't read, but that Simon, when he finally glanced toward her, understood immediately. Not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever, entirely, but recognition, the acknowledgement, between two people who had survived something together, that what had happened between them in that parking structure had been real, and that real things, whatever else they cost, cannot be taken back. The judge called a recess. The room exhaled, and outside, through the high courtroom windows, the city continued its movement, unaware that somewhere in the testimony just given, the story it had told itself about Simon Ferrari for 12 years had quietly, irrevocably, come apart. The verdict came on a Tuesday, not with drama courts rarely delivered drama at the moment itself, saving it instead for the build-up, the waiting, the sleepless nights of people whose lives hung in the procedural balance of institutional language. The actual moment was quiet. A judge's voice in a room that had learned, over the weeks of testimony, to hold its breath with some degree of discipline. Simon Ferrari stood when his name was called. He stood the way he did everything straight, unhurried, his tattooed hands loose at his sides, his dark eyes on the judge with the focused steadiness of a man who had already made his peace with the range of outcomes and was simply waiting to learn which one had been selected. The judge spoke for 11 minutes before arriving at the sentence. She spoke about the gravity of the crimes to which Simon had entered coordinated guilty pleas, the financial instruments, the facilitation, the years of infrastructure that had enabled a corruption network to operate beneath the city's surface, with devastating consequence for public institutions and private lives. She did not minimize this. She was precise and unsparing, and Simon listened to every word without flinching, because she was correct, and he had no interest in the performance of disagreement with things that were true. Then she spoke about the cooperation, the nature of it not reluctant, not extracted, but voluntary and comprehensive, the quality of the intelligence provided, the arrests it had enabled, the exposure of a deputy commissioner and a network of corrupt officials whose removal from power represented, in the court's assessment, a genuine recalibration of the city's institutional integrity. She noted that the cooperation had extended beyond the initial surrender, that Simon had continued to provide testimony and documentation across weeks of federal proceedings, with a consistency that spoke to the sincerity of the effort rather than its strategic calculation. Then she sentenced him. 4 years. Federal facility. Eligibility for continued sentence reduction, contingent on ongoing cooperation with related prosecutions still moving through the system. The public gallery reacted in the splintered way it had reacted to everything connected to this case, half in surprise that it wasn't more, half in surprise that it wasn't less, and a significant portion simply sitting in the complicated silence of people who had expected to feel certain about this moment and found that certainty had not arrived. Simon said nothing. He nodded once at the judge, not at the room, and allowed the procedural machinery to move him where it needed to move him. Victoria gave birth on a Thursday. 11 days after the sentencing, 39 weeks and 2 days into a pregnancy that had survived things. Pregnancies are not designed to survive gunfire and concrete and terror, and the particular sustained stress of a woman who had spent months mapping a corruption network while growing a human being and testifying before federal courts, while her body prepared for the most demanding physical experience available to it. She gave birth in the early hours of the morning, in a hospital room that had federal security positioned outside its door as a precaution that everyone hoped was unnecessary and no one was willing to remove. Her sister was present. Her lawyer had offered to come, and she had declined with the directness that characterized all her decisions. This was not a moment for professionals. The labor was long and honest and at no point easy, and when it was over and the room settled into the particular exhausted peace that follows the arrival of a new person into the world, Victoria held her son against her chest and looked at his face for a long time without speaking. He was complete. Perfect in the way that newborns are perfect, not in the aesthetic sense, but in the sense of being entirely, uncomplicatedly themselves, without history or damage or the weight of anything that had happened before this moment. She named him Gabriel. The monitored visit was approved on a Friday, 3 weeks into Simon's sentence. It was not standard. Nothing about the circumstances that produced it was standard, and the paperwork required to authorize a monitored hospital visit from a federal facility to a maternity ward ran through 4 levels of approval before arriving at a form that satisfied everyone's legal obligations. Simon was brought in through a service entrance, 2 federal escorts, both of whom had the professional discretion to position themselves far enough away to be present without being intrusive. He was in civilian clothes, dark trousers, a plain white shirt, no jacket. Without the suit, without the architecture of his usual presentation, he looked not diminished, but different, more substantial in some way, as though the removal of the careful surface revealed something underneath it that the surface had actually been obscuring. Victoria was sitting up in the bed when he entered. Gabriel was in the bassinet beside her, asleep with the total commitment to unconsciousness that belongs only to the very new. She watched Simon cross the room and stop at the bassinet. He looked down at the baby. He stood there for a long time without speaking, without moving, with an absolute stillness that was entirely different from the controlled stillness he used in negotiations and courtrooms and the calculated silences of power. This stillness had no strategy in it. It was the stillness of a man standing in the presence of something that had temporarily suspended his capacity for language. Gabriel slept on, indifferent and perfect. "He's healthy," Victoria said. Not a question. A statement offered as a gift the information she understood he needed and hadn't known how to ask for. Simon's jaw moved. He nodded once. His hands, the tattooed hands that had shielded her body from rifle fire, that had placed encrypted drives on a federal table, that had rested on a witness box railing, while he told a silent courtroom that she had been carrying a future. His hands remained at his sides. He didn't reach into the bassinet. She noticed this. "You can," she said quietly. He looked at her. Something crossed his face, brief and unguarded, the expression of a man who has been offered something he wants and is uncertain whether accepting it is something he's permitted to do. Not by the legal arrangement, by something older and interior and far less negotiable than federal guidelines. "I'm all right," he said. She looked at him steadily with the dark, precise gaze that had mapped financial corruption through 17 layers of misdirection and was entirely capable of mapping a person. "No," she said, not unkindly. "You're not, but you will be." Simon looked back at Gabriel. The baby's chest rose and fell with the easy rhythm of someone for whom breathing was still new and therefore required full concentration. One small fist rested against his cheek. His face, in sleep, held no knowledge of parking structures or corruption networks or the complicated man standing over him who had made his presence in this world more likely through an act that defied everything that man's life had been built upon. Simone Ferrari stood in a hospital room in civilian clothes, with 2 federal escorts positioned discreetly by the door. And for the first time since a hospital corridor 12 years ago, he allowed himself to simply be in the presence of new life, without converting the experience into something manageable. His expression, when Victoria looked at it again, had changed. The city had debated for weeks whether he was monster or redeemer. In this room, in this moment, he was neither. He was simply a man who had lost something irreplaceable, done irreparable things, and then once, at the most unexpected moment, without calculation or strategy, or any of the machinery he had used to navigate everything else chosen correctly. It wasn't absolution. But it was real, and real things, whatever else they cost, are where everything worth keeping begins. The city changed slowly, the way cities always change, not in the dramatic single-moment rupture that the headlines had suggested, but in the gradual, unglamorous work of institutions attempting to rebuild credibility with populations who had learned, through very public and very documented evidence, exactly how thoroughly they had been deceived. Deputy Commissioner Harold Price received 14 years. The sentencing was covered extensively, and the coverage had a quality of grim satisfaction to it. The decorated uniform, the charity galas, the decades of public service framing a private architecture of corruption that had cost the city in ways that financial forensic accountants were still calculating months later. Rafael Duarte received 11. He had entered a partial cooperation agreement, because even in defeat, Rafael operated with the instinct of a man preserving options that reduced his exposure without eliminating it. He was efficient about it, unemotional. He gave what he calculated was necessary and held back what he calculated he could. And the federal prosecutors accepted the arrangement because the information provided was genuinely useful, and because pursuing the maximum exposure would have consumed resources they needed elsewhere. Simone, when informed of Rafael's sentence, said nothing. He was in a federal facility that was not comfortable, but was not designed to be punitive beyond the deprivation of liberty itself. He had a single room, access to a law library that he used extensively, because understanding the precise legal architecture of his situation was the kind of problem his mind needed to work on to remain functional. He was permitted correspondence, which he used in a way that surprised the facility's administrators. He wrote letters. Not to media, not to lawyers beyond what was procedurally necessary, not to the former associates who sent cautious, carefully worded messages through approved channels in the early weeks, messages he did not answer, because the relationships they represented belonged to a version of his life he had no interest in maintaining. He wrote to people he had harmed, not all of them. He was realistic enough to understand that not all of them could be reached, and honest enough to understand that some of them would not want to be. But where he could identify a specific person, a specific consequence, a specific harm that traced back to a decision he had made or an arrangement he had enabled, he wrote. The letters were not performances of remorse. They were precise acknowledgments, what he had done, what it had cost, what he understood now that he had not understood then. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not explain himself beyond what was relevant to the person receiving the letter. He simply made the accounting direct and personal, and then left the recipient to do whatever they needed to do with it. Some letters went unanswered. Several prompted responses from lawyers threatening civil action, which he forwarded to his own legal team with instructions to cooperate fully with any civil proceedings. 3 prompted responses that were not legal and not hostile. He read those 3 letters many times. Victoria returned to work 4 months after Gabriel's birth, not to Restrepo Construction, which had been dissolved through federal asset proceedings, but to a position with a municipal oversight body established partly as a consequence of the reforms triggered by the investigation she had initiated. The appointment was not political, it was practical. The city needed people who understood how financial corruption concealed itself within legitimate structures, and Victoria Hidalgo had demonstrated, at considerable personal cost, that she understood this better than almost anyone. She brought Gabriel to the office on her first day because her sister's schedule hadn't aligned, and the alternative was a delay she didn't want. Her new colleagues were professional about it in the way that people are professional when they are secretly delighted by the presence of an infant and are attempting to respect what they perceive as the new colleague's desire for normalcy. Gabriel, for his part, slept through the entire morning and then expressed a loud and comprehensive opinion about the afternoon. which Victoria managed with the same focused efficiency she applied to everything. She did not speak publicly about Simone Ferrari. When journalists asked, and they asked, periodically, because the story had not lost its capacity to generate interest, she declined with a directness that communicated clearly that the declination was final. What she thought about him, she kept for herself. What she knew, and she knew it with the same precision she brought to financial mapping, the same ability to follow a trail through layers of misdirection to what was actually true at the center, was that the morning in the parking structure had not been strategy. She had been an accountant for 11 years. She understood the difference between a calculated investment and an instinctive act. She had reviewed, in her professional capacity, enough human behavior expressed through financial records to understand what people did when they were genuinely afraid versus what they did when they were performing courage. Simone Ferrari had been genuinely afraid. Not of the bullets, of what would happen if he didn't move. That was the thing she had never said publicly, and had no intention of saying publicly. It belonged to the parking structure, and the hospital room, and the space between two people who had survived something together, and owed each other, at minimum, the honesty of not reducing it to something simpler than it was. Gabriel grew. He had dark eyes and a serious expression when he was concentrating, and an enormous, unguarded laugh when something surprised him with delight. Victoria watched him and thought, sometimes, about what it means to choose correctly once, just once, after a long time of choosing otherwise. Whether once is enough, she had not arrived at a final answer, but she found herself believing, more often than not, that the question itself was worth sitting with. The foundation had no name attached to it publicly. Its registration documents listed a legal entity, a numbered company managed by a law firm whose partners had agreed, as a condition of their engagement, to maintain the anonymity of the directing mind behind it. Its stated purpose was the provision of legal support, financial restitution, and transitional assistance to individuals and families who had been directly harmed by organized criminal activity within the city over the preceding 15 years. The city's legal community knew, because legal communities always know, who was behind it. They did not say so publicly. There was no advantage in saying so, and a certain complex professional satisfaction in the discretion in being part of a story that the public would eventually piece together, and that was better for being pieced together gradually than announced. The Foundation's first year of operation assisted 43 individuals. The funding came from the voluntary dismantling of offshore accounts that had survived the federal asset freeze instruments held at enough legal distance from the prosecuted entities that recovering them through official proceedings would have taken years. Simone had directed their liquidation through his legal team before the distance could be tested. No credit, no announcement. Just money moving from where it had been accumulated to where it was needed, through channels that were, for the first time in his adult life, entirely legitimate. Simone was released on a gray morning in early spring. The sentence reduction had come through 2 months ahead of the original eligibility date, the result of continued cooperation with 3 related prosecutions that had extended the federal investigation well beyond its original scope, dismantling networks in 2 adjacent cities whose connections to the original corruption architecture had only emerged through the depth of Simone's knowledge of how that architecture had been constructed. He walked out of the federal facility in the same civilian clothes he had worn to Victoria's hospital room, dark trousers, a plain white shirt, no entourage, no waiting vehicles, a single bag that he carried himself. He had declined every media request. There had been many. The story had not diminished in the public's appetite for it, if anything. The time had clarified it into something more compelling, the way distance clarifies landscape. The feared Mafia boss who ran into Gunfire, who surrendered an empire, who wrote letters to his victims and dismantled his own offshore accounts and sat in a federal facility writing in a law library while the city he had shaped from the shadows slowly, imperfectly, began to reshape itself. Journalists had built careers on adjacent pieces of the story. Simone had no interest in providing the center of it. He took a taxi to an apartment arranged by his legal team, modest, functional, in a neighborhood that held no significance to his former life. He set his bag down, made coffee, stood at the window for a while looking at the street below, at the ordinary movement of ordinary morning, at the city that had feared his name and debated his nature, and was now, apparently, prepared to let him exist within it as something it didn't have a clean category for. He was all right with that. He was sitting on a bench in the park near his apartment when he saw them. He hadn't planned it. He had come to the park because the apartment was quiet in a way that required interrupting, and the park was where the city's ordinary life expressed itself most directly. Dogs and children and people moving through their days, without awareness of being observed. Victoria was walking the path that curved along the park's eastern edge. Gabriel was strapped to her chest in a carrier, facing outward, his dark eyes moving across everything with the intense, indiscriminate fascination of a child for whom the world is still entirely new. Simon did not stand. He watched them from the bench. Victoria's unhurried stride, her navy jacket, the precise way she moved through the world that he had recognized from the first moment she had looked at him in the hospital room. Gabriel's small head turning toward a passing dog with an expression of profound seriousness. Victoria looked up. She saw him. They looked at each other across the distance of the path, with the particular quality of recognition that belongs to people who have been through something together that cannot be summarized, and do not need to summarize it. She did not stop walking. She did not wave. But something shifted in her expression, a brief, fractional softening that Simon understood because he was, whatever else he was, a man who had spent his entire adult life reading rooms, reading people, understanding the meaning carried in what was not said. It was enough. Gabriel turned his head at that moment away from the dog, toward the bench, toward the man sitting there with tattooed hands resting on his knees, and an expression that the city would not have recognized, because the city had only ever seen him when he was performing something. Controlled. Armored. Precise. The child looked at him with the clear, uncomplicated attention of someone who has not yet learned to look at anything other than what is actually there. Simon looked back. Then Victoria and Gabriel rounded the curve of the path and moved beyond his line of sight, and Simon sat alone on the bench, in the ordinary morning of a city that was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to hold complicated things without resolving them into something simpler than they were. He stayed on the bench for a while longer. Then he stood, picked up his jacket, and walked in the opposite direction, not because he was retreating, not because he was calculating, but because some distances are not meant to be closed immediately. Some things are built slowly, if they are built at all, from smaller and more honest materials than the ones he had used to construct the first version of his life. He walked. The city moved around him, indifferent and continuous. He was part of it now, in a different way than he had been before. Not above it, not beneath it. Inside it, one more person navigating the ordinary difficulty of days. Redemption, he was learning, looked nothing like what he had imagined. It didn't arrive. It didn't declare itself. It was simply what happened when you stopped running from what you'd done and started, one small decision at a time, doing otherwise. He walked until the park was behind him, and the street opened up ahead. He didn't look back, but he walked lighter than he had in 12 years. And in a city that had watched him fall and surrender and be dismantled, and reduced to something human that was, somehow, exactly enough. Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.